the drowned archaeologist. Welcome back to Mindful Musings, where we explore stories that challenge the mind and soothe the soul. I'm your host, William, and today we're diving into a mystery as murky as the waters that claimed our victim. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're listening from today. Drop a comment and let me know your corner of the world. Now settle in as we follow the keen observations of Miss Jane Marple in The Drowned Archaeologist. Chapter 1. The excavation begins. The village of St. Mary Mead had been in a state of considerable excitement for the past 3 weeks. A Roman villa, or so it was believed, had been discovered in Meadowbrook Field, just beyond the churchyard wall. The field belonged to Mr. Gerald Thornbury, a London businessman who had purchased the property 2 years prior with plans to develop it into executive homes. Those plans had been temporarily halted by the archaeological discovery, though Mr. Thornbury seemed to be taking the delay with remarkable good grace, considering the potential financial implications. Dr. Marcus Ashford had arrived from the university with his team of students and volunteers to oversee the excavation. He was a man in his early 50s, lean and weathered from years of fieldwork in various countries, with sharp grey eyes that missed nothing, and a reputation for being brutally honest in his assessments. His colleagues at the university respected him enormously, though some admitted he could be difficult to work with. Dr. Ashford had no patience for sloppiness or academic dishonesty, and he had exposed more than one colleague's questionable methodology over the years. This had earned him both admirers and enemies in equal measure. Miss Jane Marple had watched the proceedings with her usual quiet interest. She often walked past the excavation site during her morning constitutional, observing the careful work of brushing away centuries of soil with small tools and soft brushes. The students worked with obvious dedication, photographing and cataloguing every find, no matter how small. Dr. Ashford had been gracious enough to explain the significance of various findings to her when she stopped to observe, seeming to appreciate her genuine curiosity and intelligent questions. The dig had attracted considerable attention from the villagers. Mrs. Price Ridley had been heard to say that having a Roman villa in the vicinity gave St. Mary Mead a certain distinction that other villages lacked. Property values in the area had already begun to rise at the mere suggestion of Roman remains, according to the local estate agent, Mr. Cummings, who had been positively gleeful about the development. Mr. Thornbury, despite the delay to his development plans, seemed oddly pleased by the discovery. He had been seen consulting frequently with local estate agents and had even commissioned a new survey of his land holdings in the area. The excavation itself had yielded some remarkable finds. Fragments of pottery, some with distinctive patterns that Dr. Ashford identified as 2nd century Roman work, coins bearing the profiles of various emperors, a bronze fibula or brooch that had caused considerable excitement among the students, several pieces of worked stone that suggested the presence of a substantial building. Dr. Ashford had been cautiously optimistic about the significance of the site, though he had mentioned to Miss Marple that he wanted to conduct more thorough analysis before making any definitive statements. On the morning of the incident, Miss Marple had encountered Dr. Ashford near the village shop. He had seemed troubled, quite different from his usual confident manner. He was clutching a small leather-bound notebook, the kind archaeologists used for field notes, and appeared to be muttering to himself about inconsistencies. When she had inquired politely if anything was amiss, he had given her a peculiar look, almost as if deciding whether to confide in her, and then said only that some things were not quite as they appeared. He mentioned he would be working late that evening, conducting some additional soil analysis in a section away from the main dig site. There was something in his tone that suggested he was troubled by more than mere academic concerns. Miss Marple had thought nothing more of it at the time, merely expressing her hope that he wouldn't overwork himself. Dr. Ashford had managed a brief smile and said that sometimes the truth required a bit of extra effort to uncover. Then he had hurried off toward the excavation site, his notebook clutched tightly under his arm. Heavy rain had begun falling that afternoon, the sort of persistent downpour that turns fields to mud and sends sensible people indoors. The sky had darkened to an ominous grey, and the wind had picked up, rattling windows and bending trees. Miss Marple had spent the evening by her fire, working on her needlepoint and listening to the rain drum against her windows with an intensity that suggested the storm would last well into the night. She had thought of Dr. Ashford out in the weather, and hoped he had sense enough to seek shelter, though knowing his dedication to his work, she rather suspected he might stay out longer than was wise. The storm had continued through the night, one of those autumn tempests that occasionally swept through the English countryside. Miss Marple had woken several times to the sound of rain lashing against the glass and the wind howling around the eaves. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a grey, damp world with puddles in every hollow and mud, tracking across previously tidy paths. The next morning dawned grey and damp, though the rain had finally ceased. Miss Marple was in her garden early, as was her habit, inspecting the damage the storm had wrought on her rose bushes. Several blooms had been stripped from their stems, and a trellis had come loose from the wall. She was examining this damage and considering whether she should call the handyman when she heard the commotion. Voices were raised near Meadowbrook Field, and there was an urgency to them that immediately caught her attention. She saw several people running in that direction, including young Tom Weatherby, who worked at the garage, and Mrs. Clement's maid, hurrying along with her apron still tied around her waist. Miss Marple felt that familiar flutter of apprehension that invariably preceded trouble in St. Mary Mead. Something had happened, something serious, and her instincts told her it involved Dr. Ashford and the excavation. Setting down her gardening gloves, Miss Marple made her way toward Meadowbrook Field with as much speed as dignity and her advancing years would allow. By the time she arrived, a small crowd had gathered near the excavation site, and Constable Polk was attempting to keep people back from the area. His face was pale, and his usually jovial manner was replaced by a grim seriousness. Dr. Marcus Ashford had been found drowned in one of the shallow excavation trenches, his body half submerged in muddy rainwater that had collected overnight. The trench was no more than 3 feet deep, hardly enough to drown a man under normal circumstances. But there he lay, face down in the murky water, his field jacket soaked through, his grey hair darkened by mud and rain. Chapter 2. An Unlikely Drowning. Inspector Slack arrived from the county police headquarters within the hour, bringing with him his usual air of hurried efficiency and ill-concealed irritation at being called to what he clearly considered a provincial backwater. Miss Marple, who had made her way to the site along with half the village, observed his arrival from a discreet distance, standing beneath an oak tree at the field's edge where she could see without being in the way. The scene was a muddy confusion of footprints and disturbed earth. The rain had ceased, but the excavation site remained waterlogged, with puddles standing in every depression and the trenches themselves filled with several inches of muddy water. Dr. Ashford's body had been discovered by Thomas Webb, one of his graduate students, who had arrived early to check on the equipment after the storm. The young man sat on an upturned bucket near the equipment shed, his face pale with shock, a blanket wrapped around his shoulders despite the fact that the morning was not particularly cold. Constable Polk stood nearby, attempting to take his statement while the young man's hands trembled so badly he could barely hold the cup of tea someone had pressed upon him. Inspector Slack surveyed the scene with undisguised skepticism, his hands on his hips, his expression suggesting this was exactly the sort of time-wasting incident he had expected. "A drowning in a 3-foot trench," he muttered to Constable Polk, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Must have slipped, hit his head, been too dazed to get up. Simple accident in bad weather." These academic types never have proper sense about field conditions, probably stayed out too late working and lost his footing in the dark. Miss Marple, who had edged closer under the pretense of offering Thomas Webb a handkerchief, as the young man seemed in need of one, studied the body before it was covered with a tarpaulin. Dr. Ashford lay face down in perhaps 18 inches of muddy water at the bottom of the trench. His clothes were thoroughly soaked, his field boots caked with mud, and his arms were positioned awkwardly beneath him. But something caught her attention immediately, something that struck her as distinctly odd. His hands, clutched at his sides, showed mud beneath the fingernails. This in itself was not surprising for an archaeologist working at a dig site, but the mud appeared oddly light in colour, almost clayey, with a yellowish tinge quite different from the dark, peaty soil of the trench where he lay. Miss Marple had lived in St. Mary Mead all her life and knew the local soils well. This lighter clay was the sort one found near the river, nearly a mile away, not in Meadowbrook Field. Dr. Haydock, who served as the village physician and police surgeon, arrived shortly after Inspector Slack and immediately went to examine the body. He was a practical, no-nonsense man who had served St. Mary Mead for over 30 years, and Miss Marple had considerable respect for his judgment. He conducted his preliminary examination with careful thoroughness, taking his time despite Inspector Slack's obvious impatience. "Time of death approximately 8 to 10 hours ago," he announced, standing up and brushing mud from his trousers. "That would place it sometime during the storm last evening, probably between 7 and 9 o'clock. Cause of death appears to be drowning. There's definitely water in the lungs, I can confirm that much. Some bruising on the left temple consistent with a fall. Could have struck his head on the edge of the trench or perhaps on a rock. The blow might have stunned him enough that he couldn't get himself out of the water." Miss Marple approached Inspector Slack with her usual diffident manner, her head tilted slightly to one side in a way that made her seem particularly harmless and elderly. "Excuse me, Inspector. I do hope I'm not interfering, but I wonder if I might mention something I observed this morning. Something that seemed a bit unusual." Inspector Slack barely concealed his sigh, his expression making it clear that he considered amateur observations from elderly village ladies to be exactly the sort of time-wasting nuisance he least needed. "Yes, Miss Marple. What is it?" His tone was patient, but barely so. "The mud beneath Dr. Ashford's fingernails," Miss Marple said, gesturing gently toward the body. "It appears to be quite different from the soil in this trench. More of a clay consistency, I should say, rather like the soil near the old pottery works by the river. Quite a distinctive yellowish colour, you see. The soil here in Meadowbrook Field is much darker, more of a rich brown. I've lived here all my life, Inspector, and I know the local soils quite well from my gardening." Inspector Slack glanced at the body with perfunctory interest, clearly unimpressed by this observation. "Rain washes all sorts of things about, Miss Marple. The man probably had his hands in different parts of the site yesterday. These archaeologists are always digging about, aren't they? Taking samples from here and there. Perfectly natural to have different soils under his nails." But Miss Marple persisted gently, though with a note of apology in her voice. "I only mention it because Dr. Ashford spoke to me yesterday morning, just before the rain started. He seemed troubled, and said he would be conducting soil analysis in a different section of the site last evening. He was quite specific about it. Perhaps that section might tell us something about his final hours. If we could determine where he was working, it might help establish exactly what happened." Dr. Haydock, who had more respect for Miss Marple's observations than the inspector, having seen her prove remarkably astute on previous occasions, examined the hands more closely. He took out a small magnifying glass from his medical bag and studied the fingernails carefully. "You know, Jane, you may have a point here. This clay is distinctly different from the trench soil. And look here, his fingernails are quite torn, several of them broken down to the quick, as if he was clawing at something. That's not consistent with normal archaeological work, even vigorous digging. This suggests a struggle of some kind." Inspector Slack frowned, his certainty wavering slightly as he too bent to look more closely. "Well, we'll take samples for analysis at the laboratory. But I still maintain this was most likely an accident. The man was working alone in foul weather, probably couldn't see properly in the dark and rain, lost his footing, struck his head, and drowned before he could recover. Tragic, certainly, but hardly mysterious." Miss Marple said nothing more, but she observed carefully as the body was photographed and eventually removed. She noticed other things too. Dr. Ashford's field notebook was nowhere to be seen, though she knew he always carried it. His equipment was scattered about in a way that seemed inconsistent with his usual methodical organization, and there were footprints in the mud near the trench, several sets, though the rain had softened them almost to illegibility. As the morning progressed and the crowd gradually dispersed, Miss Marple remained, sitting on a stone wall at the field's edge, appearing to rest, but in fact watching everything with careful attention. She saw Thomas Webb being questioned at length by Inspector Slack. She observed Mr. Thornbury arrive looking shocked and distressed, speaking urgently with the inspector. She noted the other archaeology students arriving one by one, their faces showing varying degrees of shock and grief. But what interested her most was the section of the field Dr. Ashford had mentioned working in the previous evening. It was set apart from the main excavation near the field's eastern boundary, and when she walked past it as casually as she could manage, she observed that the soil there was indeed different. Lighter, more clay-like, quite unlike the dark earth of the main dig, Someone had been digging there recently despite the rain, and someone had attempted to smooth over the evidence. Miss Marple walked home slowly, her mind working methodically through what she had observed. By the time she reached her cottage, she was quite certain of one thing. Dr. Marcus Ashford had not drowned accidentally in that shallow trench. He had been murdered, and whoever had killed him had gone to considerable trouble to make it appear an accident. Chapter 3. Curious Inconsistencies. By afternoon, news of Dr. Ashford's death had spread throughout St. Mary Mead and to the surrounding villages with the remarkable speed that tragic news always seemed to achieve in rural communities. The excavation site had been cordoned off with police tape, much to the frustration of the archaeology students who were anxious about their equipment and notes left exposed to the elements. Several of them had attempted to retrieve essential items, but had been turned away by Constable Polk, who was standing guard with instructions to let no one pass. Miss Marple spent the afternoon quietly making inquiries, as was her habit when something troubled her. She had learned over many years that information was best gathered through casual conversation rather than direct questioning, and that people were often remarkably forthcoming if approached in the right manner. She called first at the vicarage, where the vicar's wife, Griselda, was always well informed about village matters and had a network of connections that would be the envy of any intelligence service. Over tea and excellent scones that Griselda had baked that morning, the conversation naturally turned to the tragedy at Meadowbrook Field. Griselda, who was considerably younger than Miss Marple and possessed a lively, somewhat irreverent sense of humour, was uncharacteristically serious as she discussed Dr. Ashford's death. "Such a dreadful thing," she said, pouring more tea. "And in such an odd way, too. Everyone saying he must have fallen and hit his head. But honestly, Jane, does that seem likely to you?" The man had been working at archaeological sites for 30 years. You'd think he'd know better than to stand too close to the edge of a trench in the dark during a rainstorm. Miss Marple murmured agreement and then mentioned, as if it had just occurred to her, that she understood Mr. Thornbury had been at the site very early that morning, before the body was discovered. Griselda nodded eagerly. "Yes, I heard that from Mrs. Price Ridley, who had it from her maid, who was up early, doing the washing. Mr. Thornbury arrived at the site just after dawn, apparently. He claimed he'd been concerned about storm damage to the excavation and wanted to check on things, though why he didn't telephone Dr. Ashford first to coordinate the inspection I can't imagine. Rather odd, don't you think?" "How very conscientious of him," Miss Marple murmured, stirring her tea thoughtfully, "though I wonder why he was so concerned. After all, the excavation was delaying his development plans rather significantly. One might have thought he'd be less rather than more concerned about the site's welfare." Griselda's eyes brightened with interest. "That's an excellent point, Jane. In fact, I've heard some rather odd things about Mr. Thornbury's property dealings lately. The vicar mentioned that Thornbury had been purchasing additional land around Meadowbrook Field quietly through different agents. Doesn't that seem strange when the excavation is costing him money every day it continues?" Her next visit was to Mrs. Price Ridley, the village gossip, who maintained her social position largely through being better informed about everyone's business than anyone else. Mrs. Price Ridley lived in a large, rather gloomy house called the Larches, and she received Miss Marple in her drawing room with obvious pleasure at having an audience for her information. "Such a terrible shock," Mrs. Price Ridley said, settling herself into her chair with the air of someone preparing to share significant intelligence. "And I must tell you, Miss Marple, there were some very odd circumstances surrounding Dr. Ashford in the days before his death. Very odd indeed." Miss Marple expressed appropriate interest and waited for Mrs. Price Ridley to continue, which she did with obvious satisfaction. "My daily help, Mrs. Finch. You know her, of course. She was walking home 2 evenings ago, the night before the storm, and she saw Dr. Ashford having what she described as a heated discussion with someone near the pub. It was growing dark, and she couldn't see who the other person was clearly, but she said they seemed quite angry. Their voices were raised, though she couldn't make out the words. And then the other person got into a motor car. Quite an expensive-looking one, Mrs. Finch said, and drove away rather quickly." "How interesting," Miss Marple said. "I don't suppose Mrs. Finch noticed what kind of motor car it was." "She thought it might have been a Bentley or something of that sort. Dark-coloured," she said, "very sleek and expensive-looking. Not the sort of car most people around here drive." After leaving Mrs. Price Ridley, fortified with tea and a considerable amount of interesting information, Miss Marple made her way home, but she had hardly settled into her favourite chair when she received an unexpected visitor. Thomas Webb, the graduate student who had found the body, appeared at her door looking thoroughly miserable and agitated. "Miss Marple," he said as soon as she had shown him into her sitting room. "I hope you don't mind my calling unannounced, but Inspector Slack isn't taking me seriously, and I feel I must tell someone. I'm certain of it. Dr. Ashford was murdered. This wasn't an accident." Miss Marple showed him to a comfortable chair and poured tea, her manner calm and reassuring. "What makes you so certain, Mr. Webb? Please tell me everything." Thomas accepted the cup with trembling hands and took a sip before beginning. "Dr. Ashford called me 2 nights ago, quite late, probably around 10 o'clock. He sounded troubled, even a bit frightened, which was very unlike him. Dr. Ashford wasn't the sort of man who frightened easily. He said he had discovered something troubling about the artifacts we'd been finding at the excavation. He wouldn't elaborate over the telephone, but said he needed to verify his suspicions through additional testing. He specifically asked me not to mention it to anyone else on the team, not even Patricia, and she was his star student." "Go on," Miss Marple encouraged gently. Thomas set down his teacup and leaned forward earnestly. "The next day, yesterday morning, I went to the site early. I wanted to ask Dr. Ashford more about what he'd discovered. But when I got there, I noticed someone had been through his field notes. They were in his tent, where he always kept them, but they were in a slightly different order than he always maintained. Dr. Ashford was absolutely meticulous about his documentation. He had a specific system. These notes had been disturbed, I'm certain of it." "Could Dr. Ashford himself have been looking through them?" Miss Marple suggested. Thomas shook his head vigorously. "No, that's just it. I know his system. When he was working with the notes, he'd stack them a particular way, with his current work on top and reference materials underneath. These were just shuffled, as if someone had been searching through them quickly, looking for something specific. And his soil sample collection was disturbed too. Little vials of soil he'd collected from different parts of the site, all carefully labelled. Several were out of order, and 2 were missing entirely." "And you mentioned this to Inspector Slack?" Miss Marple asked. Thomas nodded miserably. He said, "I was overwrought from the shock of finding the body, that I was imagining things. He actually patted me on the shoulder and told me to go home and rest, as if I were a hysterical child. But Miss Marple, there's more. After the inspector dismissed me, I went to the section where Dr. Ashford said he'd be working last night. The area near the eastern boundary, and the soil there is completely different from the rest of the excavation. It's that pale, yellowish clay you find near the river, not the dark, peaty earth that's throughout the rest of Meadowbrook Field. Why would Dr. Ashford be taking samples from soil that doesn't match the excavation stratum? Unless," his voice dropped, "unless he suspected something was wrong with the entire dig." Miss Marple considered this carefully. "Mr. Webb, did Dr. Ashford give you any indication of what specifically troubled him about the artifacts?" "Not exactly," Thomas replied, "but he did say something odd. He said that sometimes the most interesting discoveries in archaeology weren't ancient artifacts, but rather modern deceptions. I didn't understand what he meant at the time, but now, thinking back, I believe he was suggesting that someone had been planting false artifacts at the site." That evening, Miss Marple sat by her window, working on her knitting but thinking primarily about everything she had learned. The light was fading, casting long shadows across her garden, and she watched as the village settled into its evening routine. But her mind was far from settled. She was beginning to see a pattern, though it was still incomplete, still missing crucial pieces. Dr. Ashford had discovered something that troubled him deeply, something about the artifacts or the excavation itself. He had been conducting additional analysis, taking soil samples, examining his notes, and then, during a storm, in the dark, he had ended up dead in a shallow trench with clay under his fingernails that didn't match the trench soil. Someone had been through his notes. His field notebook was missing, and people had seen him arguing with someone in an expensive car. The more Miss Marple thought about it, the more convinced she became that Thomas Webb was right. This was no accident. Dr. Marcus Ashford had been murdered, and someone had gone to considerable trouble to make it appear otherwise. Chapter 4. The Planted Evidence. The following morning brought clearer weather and clearer thinking. Miss Marple rose early, as was her habit, and after her morning tea and toast, she dressed with particular care. She had decided that today she would pay a visit to the excavation site, with or without Inspector Slack's permission. Sometimes, she had found, the best way to observe things was to simply be present, appearing harmless and elderly, while keeping one's eyes and ears very much open. She found Inspector Slack at the site examining the trenches with Dr. Haydock. The laboratory results had returned overnight on the mud samples, and the inspector's expression suggested they had not supported his simple accident theory. Miss Marple, Inspector Slack acknowledged her presence with barely concealed resignation. I suppose you've come to offer more observations. Only if they might be helpful, Inspector, Miss Marple replied mildly. I understand the laboratory results have arrived. Inspector Slack was forced to admit with obvious reluctance that the soil beneath Dr. Ashford's fingernails did not match any of the excavation site soil. It was, as Miss Marple had suggested, river clay from an area nearly a mile away, down by the old pottery works where the river bent around a stand of willows. This changes the complexion of things considerably, Dr. Haydock observed, his expression grave. If Ashford was somewhere else when he died, someone brought his body here to the excavation site. That's not an accident. That's deliberate concealment of murder. Miss Marple spoke up quietly. Inspector, might I suggest we examine the area where Mr. Webb mentioned Dr. Ashford intended to work that evening? The section with the anomalous clay soil near the eastern boundary. It seems to me that if Dr. Ashford was conducting soil analysis, that area might be significant. Inspector Slack, to his credit, led them to the location without argument. He was beginning, Miss Marple thought, to take the situation more seriously. The section in question was set apart from the main excavation, perhaps 50 yards from the primary dig site, near where an old hedgerow marked the field's boundary. The soil here was indeed different from the rest of Meadowbrook Field, lighter in colour and texture, with that distinctive yellowish cast that spoke of clay rather than the darker, richer earth elsewhere. More significantly, someone had been digging here recently. Despite attempts to cover the disturbance with loose earth and scattered leaves, the signs of excavation were evident to anyone looking carefully. The soil had been turned, then smoothed over, but not quite carefully enough to hide all evidence of the work. Dr. Haydock knelt to examine the area more closely, pushing aside the loose covering to reveal the disturbed earth beneath. This has been excavated recently. Within the past few days, I'd say, certainly within the week. But why would this section interest Ashford when the main Roman remains are over there? He gestured toward the primary excavation site. Miss Marple spoke carefully, choosing her words with precision. May I make a suggestion, Inspector? Perhaps Dr. Ashford was investigating whether this clay soil had been brought here deliberately from another location. To plant something that would appear to be an ancient artifact discovered in situ during the excavation. Inspector Slack stared at her. Plant artifacts. Why on earth would anyone do that? What would be the point? To increase the perceived historical significance of the site, Miss Marple explained patiently, which would naturally increase property values in the surrounding area. Or perhaps, she added thoughtfully, to prevent development entirely by making the site too archaeologically important to disturb. There are various motives one might consider, depending on who stood to benefit from either outcome. Inspector Slack considered this, his expression showing that he was beginning to see possibilities he hadn't considered before. You're suggesting a fraud, someone salting the dig site with fake Roman artifacts. I'm suggesting it's a possibility worth investigating, Miss Marple replied, particularly given that Dr. Ashford was troubled about something concerning the artifacts and was conducting additional soil analysis. Perhaps he suspected exactly such a fraud. Inspector Slack ordered the area carefully excavated under his supervision. It took several hours of patient work, but what they found was remarkable and deeply disturbing. Several pottery fragments, carefully buried at depths that suggested they had been there for centuries. Several coins, green with verdigris, bearing the profiles of Roman emperors. A small bronze figurine of considerable beauty. All supposedly Roman, all supposedly ancient, all carefully placed in clay that had been transported from elsewhere. The artifacts themselves, upon close inspection by Dr. Haydock, who had some knowledge of such things from his years in the British Museum's volunteer program, showed signs of artificial aging. The pottery had been deliberately chipped and stained to simulate centuries of burial. The coins showed wear patterns inconsistent with genuine ancient circulation. And the bronze figurine, beautiful though it was, had been treated with chemicals to produce the patina of age artificially. Forgeries, Dr. Haydock breathed, examining a coin through his magnifying glass. Someone has been salting the site with forgeries. These aren't ancient at all. They're modern reproductions that have been artificially aged and deliberately planted to be discovered during the excavation. And Dr. Ashford discovered it, Miss Marple added quietly. That is why he was killed. He found the fraud and was about to expose it. Someone couldn't allow that to happen. Inspector Slack's expression had transformed from skepticism to grim determination. Right, he said decisively. We need to question everyone connected with this excavation. The students, the volunteers, the property owner, everyone. Someone planted these forgeries and someone killed Dr. Ashford to keep him quiet about it. Miss Marple nodded agreement but said nothing more. She was thinking about motives, about who would benefit from such a fraud. Property values would be affected certainly. Development plans would be impacted. Reputations in the academic world might be at stake. There were multiple possible motives, and until she understood which one was correct, she couldn't be certain who had killed Dr. Marcus Ashford. As they walked back toward the main excavation site, Miss Marple noticed something caught on a bramble near the eastern boundary hedgerow. A small scrap of fabric, dark blue wool, expensive quality by the look of it. It had been torn, as if someone had pushed through the undergrowth hastily, perhaps in the dark. She carefully removed it, wrapping it in her handkerchief, and tucked it into her handbag without mentioning it to the inspector just yet. Sometimes, she had learned, it was better to keep certain observations to oneself until their significance became clear. That evening, she received a visit from Dr. Haydock, who came to discuss the post-mortem results. He settled into her sitting room with a cup of tea and a troubled expression. "Jane," he said without preamble, "I need to tell you something that I haven't yet put in my official report because I wanted to discuss it with you first. Dr. Ashford did not die in that excavation trench. The water in his lungs contains river sediment and traces of watercress, neither of which were present in the rainwater that had collected in the trench. He drowned in the river and was moved afterward to the excavation site." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "I rather suspected as much." The clay under his fingernails, the torn nails suggesting a struggle, the way his body was positioned. It all suggested he had been moved post-mortem. "There's more," Dr. Haydock continued. "The bruising on his temple occurred before death, probably rendering him unconscious or at least dazed. But there's additional bruising on his shoulders and back, the kind consistent with someone holding him down forcibly. Jane, someone held him underwater deliberately until he drowned. This wasn't an accident or even a blow that went too far. This was deliberate murder." Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. "Then whoever killed him transported his body to the excavation site and arranged it to appear as if he had fallen and drowned accidentally during the storm. They positioned him in the trench, perhaps poured additional water over him to make it seem he'd been caught in the rain. It was quite a calculated act. The question is, who had both the motive and the opportunity, Dr. Haydock said. And who had the physical strength to move a body that distance? Ashford wasn't a large man, but it's still no easy task to transport a dead body, particularly in the dark during a storm. Miss Marple reached into her handbag and withdrew the fabric she had found. "I discovered this caught on a bramble near the eastern boundary. Dark blue cashmere, expensive quality. Not the sort of fabric one wears for fieldwork. Someone in expensive clothing was in that area recently, pushing through the undergrowth, perhaps in haste." Dr. Haydock examined the fabric carefully. "This is from an overcoat, I'd say. Cashmere blend, quite expensive. We need to find out who owned such a garment and why they were at the excavation site." As Dr. Haydock left, Miss Marple sat by her window, watching the evening settle over St. Mary Mead. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to come together, though the complete picture remained frustratingly out of reach. Someone had planted forgeries at the excavation site. Dr. Ashford had discovered this fraud and been killed for it. The murderer had then gone to considerable trouble to make the death appear accidental. But who was the murderer, and what exactly had they hoped to gain by the fraud? She picked up her knitting, her needles clicking softly in the quiet room. Tomorrow, she thought, she would need to learn more about property values, about development plans, and about who exactly stood to profit from the supposed Roman villa discovery. The answer, she was certain, lay somewhere in that tangle of financial interests and personal motives. Chapter 5. The Property Connection. Inspector Slack's investigation took on new urgency following the discovery of the planted forgeries. He began interviewing everyone connected with the excavation and the property with systematic thoroughness. Mr. Gerald Thornbury was first on his list, and the London businessman arrived at the police station with his solicitor in tow, a precaution that immediately raised the inspector's suspicions. Under questioning, which took place in the small interview room at the village police station, Thornbury admitted he had met with Dr. Ashford 2 evenings before the archaeologist's death. The conversation had been tense, he acknowledged, but he insisted it had only been about funding and timeline issues, not about anything sinister. Dr. Ashford was pressuring me to extend funding for the excavation, Thornbury explained, his solicitor sitting watchfully beside him. He wanted at least another month, possibly 2. I told him that was impossible. The dig was already causing significant delays to my development project. Every day it continued was costing me money. I needed to move forward with the housing development. "And how did Dr. Ashford respond to your refusal?" Inspector Slack asked. Thornbury shifted uncomfortably. He was angry, naturally. Said I was more interested in profit than in preserving history. We had words, I won't deny it. But I certainly didn't kill the man over a disagreement about funding. But Miss Marple, consulting quietly with the inspector afterward in his office, pointed out an interesting fact she had discovered through her own discreet inquiries. Property records, which were public and available for anyone to examine at the county offices, showed that Thornbury had recently purchased 3 additional parcels of land adjacent to Meadowbrook Field. The transactions had been completed through different estate agents over the past 6 months, clearly an attempt to avoid drawing attention to a pattern of acquisition. If the Roman villa discovery was genuine and significant, Miss Marple observed, those properties would increase substantially in value. Far more than the original Meadowbrook Field. Mr. Thornbury's losses from delaying the development of one property would be more than compensated for by gains on the others. A rather clever investment strategy, if the archaeological discovery proved genuine. Inspector Slack frowned, studying the property documents. So Thornbury had motive to want the discovery to be real and significant. But then why would he plant forgeries that could eventually be exposed? Once the fraud was discovered, all the properties would lose value. Unless, Miss Marple suggested carefully, Mr. Thornbury didn't plant the forgeries. Perhaps he was as much a victim of the fraud as anyone else, or perhaps he discovered the forgeries himself, and that's what he was arguing with Dr. Ashford about. The inspector rubbed his chin thoughtfully. We need to dig deeper into Thornbury's finances. If he's in financial difficulty, that changes the equation entirely. Miss Marple had already anticipated this line of inquiry. Through connections she had cultivated over many years, including a nephew who worked in the city, she had learned some interesting facts about Gerald Thornbury's financial situation. His business ventures in London had suffered significant losses over the past year. A property development in Essex had failed spectacularly when soil contamination was discovered after purchase. An investment in a shipping company had gone badly wrong when the company's primary vessel sank in a storm. We must also consider, Miss Marple suggested, who else might benefit from an apparent archaeological discovery. Estate agents, perhaps, who would see increased business from rising property values. Or other property owners in the area who might wish to see their land increase in value. Or conversely, who might benefit from the discovery being proven false. Inspector Slack's investigation expanded to include the local estate agents. Mr. Cummings, who ran the primary agency in St. Mary Mead, had been remarkably enthusiastic about the Roman villa discovery, as several villagers had noted. He had already begun advertising properties in the area as being near this exciting historical site, despite the fact that the excavation had not yet been completed or the findings verified. When questioned, Mr. Cummings admitted he had advised several property owners to hold off on selling until after the archaeological findings were confirmed, as he expected values to rise significantly. He had also, it turned out, purchased a small cottage and plot of land near Meadowbrook Field just days after the initial discovery was announced. A speculative investment, he called it, though it suggested he had considerable faith in the discovery's authenticity. Miss Marple also learned, through her network of village connections that included the vicar, the doctor, and several long-time residents, that Thornbury had been quietly marketing his newly acquired properties to potential buyers. He had circulated glossy brochures emphasizing their proximity to the historical site, their rural character with easy access to London, and the potential for significant appreciation. He had already received offers far exceeding his purchase price, all contingent on the archaeological findings being confirmed as genuine and the area being designated as having historical significance. The picture that was emerging was complex. Thornbury desperately needed money, that much was clear. He had suffered business losses and needed the property sales to succeed. But would a genuine archaeological find help or hinder his plans? It could go either way. A genuine find might increase values, but also bring restrictions and preservation orders that would limit development. Fraudulent finds would inflate values temporarily, but eventually collapse when discovered, destroying everything. That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a call on Mrs. Thornbury at the family's temporary residence in the village, a pleasant house they had rented while overseeing the Meadowbrook Field project. She found the woman in a state of considerable distress, her usually immaculate appearance somewhat dishevelled, her eyes red from crying. Over tea, which Mrs. Thornbury served with trembling hands, Miss Marple gently drew out the woman's concerns. Mrs. Thornbury was clearly frightened for her husband, convinced that the police suspected him of murder. She insisted repeatedly that Gerald was incapable of violence, that he had been devastated by Dr. Ashford's death, that he had only wanted to build nice homes for families, not cause any trouble. "My husband is a good man, Miss Marple," Mrs. Thornbury said, her voice breaking. "He's been under terrible stress with the business losses, but he would never hurt anyone. Never!" He was actually excited about the Roman villa discovery, thought it gave the development project a unique selling point. He was planning to call it Roman Villa Gardens or something like that. But during their conversation, Miss Marple noticed several books on Roman archaeology prominently displayed on the sitting room shelves, all recently purchased judging by their pristine condition. For someone supposedly frustrated by the dig's delays, Thornbury had been remarkably interested in the subject matter. There were volumes on Roman Britain, on villa architecture, on pottery and coins and daily life in Roman times. The books showed signs of having been read and studied, with bookmarks protruding from various pages. More interesting still, Miss Marple noticed a map of the area spread on the desk in the corner, marked with notations in what appeared to be Thornbury's handwriting. The map showed not only Meadowbrook Field but also the surrounding properties, with circles drawn around specific parcels and notes about soil types, drainage and archaeological potential. When Miss Marple gently inquired about the map, Mrs. Thornbury flushed slightly. "Gerald has been studying the area very carefully. He likes to be thorough in his projects. He's been learning about Roman settlement patterns, trying to understand where other remains might be found. He thought if there were more discoveries nearby, it would make the whole area more valuable." Miss Marple found this very interesting indeed. It suggested Thornbury had been deeply invested in the archaeological aspects of the project, not merely viewing the dig as an irritating delay. But it also raised questions. Had Thornbury's studies led him to suspect the forgeries? Or had his knowledge of Roman archaeology enabled him to create convincing forgeries in the first place? That evening, Miss Marple received an unexpected telephone call from Thomas Webb. The young man sounded agitated, speaking quickly and quietly as if afraid of being overheard. "Miss Marple, I've discovered something. I've been going through Dr. Ashford's papers, the ones the police haven't taken. There was a letter tucked into one of his reference books. It's from someone warning him to stop asking questions about the artifacts. It's not signed, but it's threatening. It says that some things are better left buried, and that curiosity can be dangerous." "Did you show this to Inspector Slack?" Miss Marple asked. "Not yet," Thomas admitted. "I only just found it, and I wanted to tell you first. There's something else too. I've been reviewing the photographs we took of the artifacts as they were discovered. Some of them show the stratum layers, the soil levels. And Miss Marple, the coins and pottery fragments that were supposedly found at Roman levels, they're in disturbed soil. You can see it in the photographs if you know what to look for. The soil around them has been recently turned, not undisturbed for centuries." "That's very important evidence, Mr. Webb," Miss Marple said. "You must take both the letter and the photographs to Inspector Slack immediately. Don't delay." After the call ended, Miss Marple sat thinking for a long time. The case was becoming clearer, but there were still pieces that didn't fit. She needed to understand the complete picture before she could identify the killer with certainty. And she had a feeling that the answer lay not just in property values and financial motives, but in something more personal, more desperate. Chapter 6. The Missing Notebook. Thomas Webb arrived at Miss Marple's cottage early the next morning, before she had even finished her breakfast. He looked as though he hadn't slept, his eyes hollow and his clothes rumpled. Miss Marple invited him in and immediately made fresh tea, the remedy she had found most effective for all manner of distresses. "Dr. Ashford's field notebook is missing," Thomas said without preamble, his hands wrapped around the teacup as if seeking its warmth. "The one he always kept with him. All his other notes and records are accounted for, I've checked thoroughly. But that particular notebook, the one he was carrying the morning before his death, the one he would have used to record his soil analysis and observations about the forgeries, it's vanished completely." "Inspector Slack suggested it was washed away in the rain," Miss Marple prompted gently. "That's impossible," Thomas insisted, his voice rising with frustration. "Dr. Ashford kept that notebook in a waterproof case. It was specially designed for field work. Even if he'd dropped it during the storm, it wouldn't have been damaged or washed away. Someone took it deliberately. It contained evidence of the forgeries, his analysis, his suspicions about who might be responsible. Without it, we only have my word about what he told me over the telephone." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Have you searched Dr. Ashford's tent at the excavation site, his lodgings at the inn?" "Everywhere," Thomas replied. "I've turned his tent inside out. The inn landlady let me search his room there. I've checked the equipment shed, even looked through the rubbish bins in case someone discarded it. It's gone, Miss Marple. And whoever took it must have done so either just before or just after killing Dr. Ashford." That afternoon, acting on an instinct that had served her well over many years of observation, Miss Marple decided to take a walk along the river. She told herself it was for the exercise and the fresh air, but in reality she wanted to examine the area where the clay matching Dr. Ashford's fingernails had originated. The riverbank was less than a mile from the village centre, accessed by a footpath that wound through a small wood before emerging near the water's edge. The area was secluded, sheltered by willow trees whose branches drooped toward the water. The bank here was muddy and treacherous, especially after the recent rain. The clay soil was exposed where the river had cut away at the bank over years, creating a steep drop to the water below. It would be a dangerous place in the dark, easy to lose one's footing, easy for someone to be pushed or held under the water. Miss Marple examined the area carefully, using her walking stick to part the undergrowth and reveal what lay beneath. The signs of recent disturbance were there if one knew where to look. Flattened grass where someone had struggled, scuff marks in the clay where feet had slipped seeking purchase, and there, caught on a low-hanging branch, another scrap of that distinctive dark blue cashmere wool. But there was something else too, something that made Miss Marple's heart quicken with the excitement of discovery. Partially buried in the mud at the water's edge, she found a button. It was distinctive, made of horn with a particular pattern carved into it, the sort of expensive button one found on a high-quality overcoat. She carefully retrieved it, cleaned it with her handkerchief, and studied it closely. It was, she was quite certain, from the same garment as the fabric she had found at the excavation site. More importantly, caught in the roots of a willow at the water's edge, she found what appeared to be the leather corner of a notebook. It was sodden, damaged beyond recovery, but it was clearly from a field notebook of the type archaeologists used. Someone had thrown Dr. Ashford's notebook into the river, but they hadn't thrown it far enough. Instead of being carried away by the current, it had caught in the willow roots and remained there as evidence of what had happened. Miss Marple carefully retrieved the fragment, wrapping it in her handkerchief. It wasn't enough to read any of the contents, but it proved the notebook had been here, at this spot where Dr. Ashford had died. The killer had taken it from his body and attempted to dispose of it in the river, not realizing that a fragment would remain caught in the roots. She made her way back to the village and went directly to Inspector Slack's temporary office in the village hall. She presented her findings, the button, the second fabric scrap, and most importantly, the notebook fragment. The inspector examined them with growing interest, his skepticism about her involvement in the case finally giving way to grudging respect. "This is excellent work, Miss Marple," he admitted. "We can match the button and fabric to a specific garment, and the notebook fragment proves Dr. Ashford was killed at the river, just as Dr. Haydock's post-mortem suggested. The question now is, whose coat are we looking for?" Miss Marple had been giving this considerable thought. The coat would be expensive, dark blue cashmere, with distinctive carved horn buttons. Not many people in St. Mary Mead owned such garments, It was the sort of thing a wealthy businessman might wear, or perhaps an academic with independent means. She mentally reviewed everyone connected with the case, trying to recall what they had been wearing during recent encounters. That evening, there was a village meeting at the hall to discuss the future of the Meadowbrook Field excavation in light of Dr. Ashford's death. The university had sent a representative to explain that they would be sending another archaeologist to complete the assessment, but that the project would be delayed for several weeks. Many villagers attended, curious about the implications for property values and development plans. Miss Marple arrived early and positioned herself where she could observe everyone as they entered. Mr. Thornbury came in wearing a dark blue overcoat, and Miss Marple's heart quickened with interest. It was certainly expensive-looking, certainly cashmere or a similar material, but when she casually manoeuvred closer to him during the refreshment interval, ostensibly to discuss the weather, she was able to observe that the coat's buttons were leather, not carved horn, and there were no visible repairs or missing buttons. However, she did notice that Mr. Thornbury seemed uncomfortable, his eyes darting around the room nervously. When someone mentioned Dr. Ashford's death, he visibly paled and excused himself, stepping outside for air. Miss Marple found this reaction interesting but not conclusive. A guilty conscience might produce such behaviour, but so might simple distress at being suspected of murder. During the meeting, Mr. Thornbury spoke about his plans for the property development, emphasising how the archaeological discovery, tragic as Dr. Ashford's death was, need not derail progress for the community. He spoke about balancing historical preservation with modern development needs, about creating a project that would honour the area's heritage while providing quality housing. He was articulate and persuasive, but Miss Marple noticed his hands shook slightly as he gestured, and he repeatedly touched his throat as if his collar were too tight. After the meeting, as people were leaving, Miss Marple approached Mr. Thornbury with her usual mild manner. "What a lovely coat you're wearing, Mr. Thornbury," she remarked pleasantly, "though I notice it's been mended on the left sleeve. What a shame to damage such a fine garment." Thornbury glanced down at his sleeve, where indeed there was a careful repair. "Yes," he said, his voice oddly strained. "Caught it on some brambles during a country walk. These things happen. I had it mended by a tailor in London." "Near the river, perhaps," Miss Marple suggested mildly. "It's so easy to slip on those muddy banks, especially after rain. One has to be so careful." Thornbury's face drained of colour. He stared at Miss Marple for a long moment, and she could see the fear in his eyes. Then, without another word, he turned abruptly and left the meeting, walking quickly to his car and driving away with unusual haste. Miss Marple watched him go with considerable interest. She had certainly touched a nerve, though whether it was the nerve of guilt or the nerve of fear was not yet entirely clear. She would need to proceed carefully from this point. If Thornbury was the killer, she had just alerted him that she suspected. If he wasn't, she might have frightened an innocent man unnecessarily. As she walked home through the quiet village streets, Miss Marple reflected on the complexities of human nature. People did terrible things for all sorts of reasons: money, fear, pride, desperation. The key was understanding which reason applied in this particular case, and she was beginning to have her suspicions, though she needed more evidence before she could be certain. Chapter 7. The Rival Archaeologist. The next morning brought a new development that complicated the case considerably. Inspector Slack arrived at Miss Marple's cottage with news that added another layer of suspicion to an already complex investigation. A Dr. Simon Cartwright had been identified as having connections to the case, and his presence in the area raised troubling questions. "Dr. Cartwright is an archaeologist," Inspector Slack explained, consulting his notebook as they sat in Miss Marple's sitting room. He had a professional rivalry with Dr. Ashford going back several years, competed for the same university appointment that Ashford ultimately received. Cartwright was quite vocal in his criticism of Ashford's methods, even published a paper last year questioning Ashford's findings at a previous excavation in Somerset. "And where is Dr. Cartwright now?" Miss Marple asked, pouring tea. "That's the interesting part," the inspector replied. "He's been staying at the King's Arms Hotel in the neighbouring town for the past week. Claims he was on holiday, walking in the countryside. But the hotel staff report he was away most evenings, returning late and often muddy. His boots, one maid noticed, were caked with the same kind of clay we found under Ashford's fingernails." Miss Marple absorbed this information thoughtfully. "Has Dr. Cartwright been questioned? He's coming in this afternoon. I thought you might like—" "To be present, Miss Marple." Your observations have proven valuable, and you have a way of noticing things that others miss. At 2 o'clock that afternoon, Dr. Simon Cartwright arrived at the village hall for questioning. He was a man in his late 40s with thinning sandy hair, pale blue eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, and a thin, rather pinched face that suggested a naturally suspicious disposition. He wore brown tweed that had seen better days and carried himself with the slightly defensive posture of someone accustomed to being undervalued. Miss Marple positioned herself in a corner of the room, working on her knitting but listening intently to every word. Inspector Slack conducted the interview with admirable thoroughness. "Dr. Cartwright, I understand you've been in the area for the past week. Would you mind explaining your purpose here?" Cartwright adjusted his spectacles nervously. "I was on holiday, as I said. Walking, bird-watching, that sort of thing. I had no specific agenda." Inspector Slack leaned forward. "Come now, Doctor. You are staying 3 miles from an excavation site run by your professional rival, a man whose work you had publicly criticized. Are you seriously suggesting that's coincidence?" Cartwright flushed. "All right. Yes, I was curious about Ashford's work here. Archaeological sites aren't private property, Inspector. I had every right to observe what was happening at Meadowbrook Field. I wanted to see whether his methods here were as questionable as I believed his previous work to be." "And were they?" the inspector pressed. Cartwright hesitated, his fingers drumming nervously on the arm of his chair. "I noticed some irregularities, yes. Artifacts that seemed inconsistent with the stratum they were supposedly found in. The pottery patterns didn't quite match the coins chronologically. I was planning to request an independent review of the findings." "So you knew the artifacts might be forgeries?" Inspector Slack said sharply. "I suspected something was wrong," Cartwright admitted. "But I didn't kill Ashford. Why would I? His failure would have vindicated my criticisms. If he was caught up in a fraud, whether as perpetrator or victim, it would have damaged his reputation irreparably. I had everything to gain by letting him expose himself. But if Dr. Ashford had discovered the forgeries himself and was about to expose them," Miss Marple interjected quietly from her corner, "that would have demonstrated his integrity and professional competence. He would have emerged from the situation with his reputation enhanced, not damaged. Unless, of course, someone prevented him from making that exposure." Cartwright turned to stare at her, surprise evident on his face. "I suppose that's true. But it wasn't me who prevented it. I was nowhere near the excavation site the night Ashford died." "Can anyone confirm your whereabouts that evening?" Inspector Slack asked. "I was in my hotel room reading. The storm was terrible. I had no intention of going out in it." "The hotel staff can confirm I had dinner in the dining room at 7, then went up to my room." Inspector Slack made notes but looked sceptical. "The hotel staff can confirm you had dinner, but they can't confirm you stayed in your room all evening. You could easily have left through a side entrance, gone to the river where Dr. Ashford was conducting his analysis, and returned without being seen." After Cartwright left, looking shaken and defensive, Inspector Slack turned to Miss Marple. "What do you make of him?" Miss Marple's needles clicked thoughtfully. He certainly had professional motive, and he was in the area. "But, Inspector, I noticed his coat hanging on the stand. It's brown tweed, not dark blue cashmere, and his boots, while muddy, are well-worn field boots with rubber soles, not the expensive leather shoes that would have made the prints we found by the river." The inspector nodded slowly. "You're saying he doesn't fit the physical evidence. I'm saying we should be cautious about assuming he's our killer simply because he had motive. The physical evidence points to someone else, someone wealthier, someone who wears expensive clothing and owns a dark blue cashmere overcoat with carved horn buttons." That evening, Miss Marple attended a small dinner party at the vicarage, one of those regular social gatherings that help maintain the fabric of village life. Most of the key figures in the case were present. Mr. Thornbury and his wife, several of the archaeology students including Thomas Webb and Patricia Marsh, Mr. Cummings the estate agent, and even Dr. Cartwright, who had been invited by the vicar in an attempt to help him feel welcome in the area despite the suspicion surrounding him. Miss Marple observed them all carefully throughout the evening, noting how they interacted, what they said, and more importantly, what they didn't say. Mr. Thornbury was particularly nervous, drinking more wine than was wise and speaking too loudly about inconsequential matters. His wife watched him with worried eyes, her hand occasionally reaching out to touch his arm in a gesture that seemed both comforting and restraining. Patricia Marsh, the young archaeology student, seemed deeply troubled. She barely touched her food and spent much of the dinner staring at her plate. When someone mentioned Dr. Ashford, she excused herself abruptly and left the room for several minutes. When she returned, her eyes were red as if she had been crying. Dr. Cartwright, surprisingly, was quite charming when not being interrogated by police. He spoke knowledgeably about Roman Britain, about archaeological methodology, about the challenges of distinguishing genuine artifacts from forgeries. He seemed genuinely passionate about his work, and Miss Marple found herself thinking that his rivalry with Dr. Ashford might have been more about professional standards than personal animosity. During the after-dinner coffee, Miss Marple found herself in conversation with Patricia Marsh. The young woman seemed eager to talk, as if unburdening herself would provide some relief from the weight she was carrying. Dr. Ashford was the best mentor I could have hoped for, Patricia said, her voice trembling slightly. He taught me to care about truth in archaeology, about integrity in research. He used to say that every artifact tells a story, but only if we're honest about where it came from and how we found it. He sounds like a man of considerable principle, Miss Marple observed gently. He was, Patricia agreed. That's why, when he discovered the forgeries, there was no question of him keeping quiet about it. He said that archaeology is built on trust, and that fraudulent artifacts destroy that trust for everyone. He was planning to write a full report exposing the fraud, naming everyone involved. Miss Marple's needles paused momentarily. Did he tell you who he thought was responsible for planting the forgeries? Patricia's face crumpled. He had suspicions, but he wanted to be certain before making accusations. He was going to conduct final tests that night, the night he died. He was meeting someone by the river, someone he thought could provide answers. He asked me to come too, as a witness. Miss Marple felt a sudden chill. You were there, at the river, that night. Patricia nodded miserably, tears beginning to stream down her face. I was there, Miss Marple. I saw what happened, and I've been too frightened to tell anyone the truth. Chapter 8. The Confession That Wasn't. The morning following the dinner party, Miss Marple woke with a sense of anticipation. Patricia Marsh's admission that she had been present at Dr. Ashford's death changed everything. The young woman had promised to come to Miss Marple's cottage first thing in the morning to provide a full account of what she had witnessed. Inspector Slack had been notified and would be present to hear the statement formally. They gathered in Miss Marple's sitting room at 9 o'clock. Patricia sat in the chair by the window, her hands twisted in her lap, her face pale but determined. Inspector Slack sat with his notebook ready. Dr. Haydock was present as well, at Miss Marple's request, in case the young woman needed medical support. The telling of such a story would not be easy. Patricia began haltingly, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Ashford telephoned me that evening, around 6 o'clock, just as the storm was beginning. He said he had arranged to meet someone by the river at 8. He wanted me there as a witness because he was going to confront this person about the forgeries. He wouldn't tell me who it was over the phone, just that it was someone who had been planting the artifacts and that he finally had proof. Go on, Inspector Slack encouraged gently. I arrived at the river around 7:45. The storm was terrible by then, rain pouring down, wind making the trees thrash about. I could barely see where I was going. Found the spot where Dr. Ashford had said to meet, that sheltered area under the willows where the clay bank is exposed. Dr. Ashford was already there, standing near the water's edge. He had his notebook out, protected under his waterproof jacket, making notes by the light of his torch. Was he alone? Miss Marple asked quietly. Patricia shook her head. No, there was someone with him, a man. They were arguing, their voices raised, though I couldn't hear the words over the storm. I stayed back in the trees, not wanting to interrupt until Dr. Ashford called for me. That's when I recognized the other man. It was, she paused, taking a shuddering breath. It was your father, wasn't it? Miss Marple said gently. Mr. Reginald Marsh. Patricia's eyes widened in shock. How did you know? Miss Marple set down her knitting. Several things suggested it, my dear. Your father owns property near Meadowbrook Field. Property that would increase in value if the archaeological discovery proved significant. You've been deeply troubled ever since Dr. Ashford's death, more than mere grief would explain. And you mentioned that Dr. Ashford asked you to come as a witness, which suggests he knew there was a connection between you and the person he was confronting. Patricia buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs. Yes, It was my father. He was desperate, Miss Marple. He had made terrible investments, taken loans he couldn't repay. He learned about the excavation at Meadowbrook Field and saw an opportunity. He's an amateur archaeologist himself, has been collecting Roman artifacts for years. He thought if he planted some of his genuine pieces at the site, mixed with some clever forgeries, it would make the discovery seem more significant. Property values would rise before anyone examined the artifacts closely enough to discover the fraud. And you knew what he had done, Inspector Slack stated. Not at first, Patricia said, lifting her tear-stained face. I didn't know anything about it until Dr. Ashford started having doubts. Then my father confessed to me, begged me to help him cover it up. He said it would destroy our family if the truth came out. He'd go to prison. We'd lose everything. I tried to discourage Dr. Ashford's investigation without arousing his suspicions. I rearranged his notes, hoping to confuse him. I suggested that perhaps he was being overly cautious, that the artifacts could be genuine. But Dr. Ashford was too thorough. He discovered the truth. What happened at the river that night? Inspector Slack pressed. Patricia took a shuddering breath. They were arguing. My father was begging Dr. Ashford not to report the forgeries. He said it would destroy our family, that his wife was ill, that I would lose my place at university, that everything we had worked for would be gone. Dr. Ashford was sympathetic but adamant. He said his reputation and the integrity of archaeology were at stake. He couldn't let a fraud of this magnitude go unreported. The room was silent except for the ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece. Patricia continued, her voice hollow with remembered horror. My father became desperate. He grabbed Dr. Ashford's arm, pleading. They struggled on the muddy riverbank. Dr. Ashford's torch fell into the water. In the darkness and rain, I could barely see what was happening. Then Dr. Ashford slipped, or my father pushed him, I'm not certain which. He fell backwards, hit his head on a rock, and tumbled into the river. Miss Marple leaned forward. What happened next, dear? My father went into the water after him. At first I thought he was trying to save him, but then Patricia's voice dropped to a whisper. He held him down. Dr. Ashford was stunned from the blow to his head, struggling weakly. My father held him under the water. I screamed at him to stop, ran down to the bank, but I slipped in the mud and fell. By the time I got to them, Dr. Ashford was dead. Inspector Slack's expression was grim. And then what happened? Patricia was crying openly now. My father pulled Dr. Ashford's body from the river. He was in a complete panic, saying we had to make it look like an accident. He said if anyone found out what had happened, he'd go to prison for murder. He made me help him carry the body to the excavation site. We positioned him in one of the trenches, made it look like he'd been working when he fell. My father took Dr. Ashford's notebook and threw it in the river. We tried to arrange everything so it would seem like an accident during the storm. Miss Marple spoke gently. And the cameo brooch that was supposedly given to Timothy Blackwood. Did you take that as well? Patricia looked confused. No, I don't know anything about a brooch. I only know about... She stopped suddenly, her eyes widening. Wait, you said Timothy Blackwood, but Dr. Ashford's nephew is named Timothy Ashford, not Blackwood. There was a sudden, charged silence in the room. Inspector Slack and Miss Marple exchanged glances. Something was wrong, very wrong. Miss Marple felt the pieces of the puzzle shifting, rearranging themselves into a different pattern entirely. Miss Marsh, Miss Marple said carefully, are you quite certain about everything you've just told us? About your father being at the river, about what happened? Patricia nodded earnestly. I swear it's the truth, every word. Then I'm afraid, Miss Marple said quietly, there's something you should know, and I believe we need to find your father immediately, because I don't think you've told us the entire truth. Not because you're lying, but because you didn't see everything that happened that night. Chapter 9. The Student's Secret. Inspector Slack dispatched officers immediately to locate Reginald Marsh, while Patricia was taken to the village hall to provide a formal written statement. Miss Marple requested a private word with the inspector before he left to oversee the arrest. Inspector, I don't believe Patricia's account is complete, she said, her expression troubled. Something about it doesn't align with the physical evidence. The fabric scraps we found, the button, they're from an expensive cashmere overcoat. Patricia described her father as being in financial difficulty. Would such a man own an expensive cashmere coat? The inspector frowned. You're right. And the coat fragment you found was fresh, recently torn. If Marsh had worn that coat to the river a week ago, the fabric would show more weathering. "There's something else," Miss Marple continued. "Patricia said she tried to discourage Dr. Ashford's investigation by rearranging his notes, but she didn't mention taking anything or destroying evidence. Yet the notebook fragment we found at the river suggests someone attempted to destroy it there, not just throw it in. There are signs it was partially burned before being tossed into the water. What are you suggesting, Miss Marple?" "I'm suggesting that Patricia witnessed something at the river that night, but perhaps not everything. Or perhaps," Miss Marple paused delicately, "she's protecting someone else in addition to her father. Someone who arrived after the initial confrontation, someone who wore an expensive coat and who ensured Dr. Ashford didn't survive to expose the fraud." That afternoon, Miss Marple made some discreet inquiries of her own. She called on several villagers asking seemingly innocent questions about property ownership, family connections, and financial situations. She visited the library and examined old newspapers looking for information about property transactions and business dealings. She telephoned her nephew Raymond in London and asked him to make certain inquiries through his professional connections. By evening, she had assembled a troubling picture. The Marsh family's financial difficulties were real and severe. Reginald Marsh had indeed made disastrous investments and stood on the brink of bankruptcy. But there was more to the story than Patricia had revealed, perhaps more than she herself knew. Reginald Marsh had not acted alone in planting the forgeries. He had a partner, someone with the financial resources to purchase convincing forgeries, someone with detailed knowledge of the property market, someone who stood to gain even more than Marsh from the fraud's success. That someone was Gerald Thornbury. The partnership made perfect sense once Miss Marple understood it. Thornbury owned the primary excavation site and surrounding properties. Marsh owned several smaller parcels nearby. Both needed property values to rise. Thornbury had the money and connections to acquire high-quality forgeries. Marsh had the archaeological knowledge to plant them convincingly, and the legitimate access to the site through his daughter's involvement with the excavation. But Dr. Ashford had discovered the fraud. He had arranged to confront Reginald Marsh at the river that evening, with Patricia present as witness. The confrontation had occurred, as Patricia described. But what she hadn't seen, what she couldn't have known in the darkness and confusion, was that Gerald Thornbury had also been there. Miss Marple pieced together what must have happened. Marsh had contacted Thornbury in a panic after Dr. Ashford's telephone call. Thornbury had insisted on being present at the confrontation, hoping to persuade or perhaps threaten Ashford into silence. He had arrived separately, parking his car further away, approaching through the woods wearing his expensive dark blue cashmere overcoat despite the rain. When the struggle occurred and Ashford fell into the river, striking his head, it was Thornbury who had held him down, ensuring he drowned. Marsh had helped arrange the scene afterward, but it was Thornbury who had committed the actual murder. And it was Thornbury who had taken Ashford's notebook, attempted to burn it, then thrown the remains in the river. Patricia had seen her father struggling with Dr. Ashford, had seen the drowning, but in the darkness and rain and her own panic, she hadn't realized there was a third person present. She thought her father alone was responsible for the death. She had been protecting him, carrying the terrible burden of believing her father a murderer. But the physical evidence told a different story. The expensive cashmere coat belonged to Thornbury. The carved horn button was from his coat. He had torn the fabric pushing through brambles in his haste to reach the river in the storm. And afterward, realizing the damage to his coat might be noticed, he had it carefully mended by an expensive tailor in London. That evening, Miss Marple telephoned Inspector Slack with her conclusions. The inspector listened carefully, asked several pointed questions, and then admitted that her reasoning was sound. Reginald Marsh had been located and was being brought in for questioning. Thornbury would be arrested simultaneously before he could flee or destroy evidence. The arrests took place that night. Both men were charged with conspiracy to commit fraud and with the murder of Dr. Marcus Ashford. Patricia Marsh, her testimony now understood in its proper context, would be charged as an accessory after the fact for helping to conceal the crime, though the inspector indicated that given her age and the pressure she had been under, the charges might be reduced in exchange for her cooperation. Mrs. Thornbury, devastated by her husband's arrest, came to see Miss Marple the following morning. The woman looked as though she had aged 10 years overnight, her face drawn and pale, her hands trembling as she accepted the tea Miss Marple offered. "I didn't know," she said over and over. "I didn't know what Gerald had done. The property dealings, yes, I knew about those. But the forgeries, the murder, I had no idea. How could I have been so blind?" Miss Marple spoke gently. "We often fail to see what's closest to us, my dear. We want to believe the best of those we love. That's not blindness. That's loyalty. You're not responsible for your husband's choices." "But there were signs, weren't there?" Mrs. Thornbury said. "The stress, the secretive meetings, his behaviour that night after the storm. He came home very late, his coat was muddy and torn. He said he'd been checking on the excavation site, worried about storm damage. I believed him because I wanted to believe him." After Mrs. Thornbury left, Miss Marple sat for a long time thinking about the case and its resolution. Two men, both desperate in their different ways, had conspired to commit fraud. When their scheme was threatened with exposure, one of them had committed murder, and a young woman, trying to protect her father, had nearly destroyed her own future by helping to conceal the crime. The tragedy of it all was that none of it had been necessary. As Miss Marple had discovered through her inquiries, there were legal remedies available for both men's financial difficulties. Marsh could have declared bankruptcy and started over. Thornbury could have sold some of his properties at a loss, but avoided complete ruin. Instead, they had chosen deception, and that deception had led inexorably to murder. Chapter 10. The Final Pieces. The trial of Gerald Thornbury and Reginald Marsh attracted considerable attention, not just locally but throughout the country. The combination of archaeological fraud, property speculation, and murder in a quiet English village provided exactly the sort of scandal that newspapers loved. Reporters descended on St. Mary Mead, much to the dismay of the vicar and the delight of Mrs. Price Ridley, who found herself much in demand for interviews about village life and her observations of the accused. Miss Marple attended the trial, sitting quietly in the public gallery, observing the proceedings with the same careful attention she brought to all matters of human behaviour. The evidence was presented methodically, the forged artefacts, the planted soil, the financial records showing the partnership between Thornbury and Marsh. Dr. Haydock's testimony about the cause of death and the location where the drowning actually occurred. Thomas Webb's evidence about Dr. Ashford's suspicions and the missing notebook. The fragment of notebook that Miss Marple had found proved crucial. Laboratory analysis showed it had been partially burned before being thrown in the river, and the burn marks matched a lighter that was found in Thornbury's car. The fabric and button matched Thornbury's repaired coat perfectly. Most damning of all, a witness came forward, a late-night dog walker who had seen Thornbury's distinctive Bentley parked near the river path on the night of the murder. Patricia Marsh testified for the prosecution, her voice steady though her face was pale. She described her father's confession about planting the artefacts, Dr. Ashford's determination to expose the fraud, and the confrontation at the river. But she also admitted, with obvious pain, that she now understood there had been someone else present that night, someone she hadn't seen in the darkness and confusion. Her father, Reginald Marsh, testified as well, having agreed to cooperate in exchange for a reduced sentence. He described the partnership with Thornbury, how they had planned the fraud together. He admitted to the confrontation with Dr. Ashford, to the struggle on the river bank, to helping arrange the body afterward. But he insisted that it was Thornbury who had held Ashford underwater, Thornbury who had committed the actual murder. Thornbury's defence attempted to argue that the death had been accidental, a tragic result of a struggle that got out of hand. But the prosecution's case was too strong. The deliberate drowning, the careful staging of the scene, the destruction of evidence all pointed to premeditated murder rather than manslaughter. The jury deliberated for only 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts for both men. Thornbury was sentenced to life imprisonment for murder. Marsh received a shorter sentence for manslaughter and conspiracy, the court accepting that while he had been present and had helped conceal the crime, he had not committed the actual killing. Patricia Marsh was given a suspended sentence and community service, the judge taking into account her youth, the pressure she had been under, and her cooperation with the investigation. The university allowed her to continue her studies, though she transferred to a different institution where she could make a fresh start away from the scandal. A week after the trial concluded, Miss Marple received a visit from Thomas Webb. The young man looked better than he had in weeks, the haunted expression gone from his eyes. replaced by a quiet determination. "I wanted to thank you, Miss Marple," he said, accepting the tea she offered. "If you hadn't insisted on investigating, if you hadn't found that evidence at the river, Dr. Ashford's murder might have been written off as an accident. He deserved better than that." "Dr. Ashford sounds like he was a fine man," Miss Marple said, "a man of integrity who cared about truth." "He was," Thomas agreed, "and I intend to honour his memory by following his example. I'm going to specialise in artefact authentication. There's too much fraud in archaeology, too many people willing to falsify findings for money or fame. I want to help prevent that. I think Dr. Ashford would approve of that choice," Miss Marple said with a smile. After Thomas left, Miss Marple sat in her favourite chair by the window, her knitting in her lap, looking out at the peaceful village scene. St. Mary Mead had returned to its normal quiet rhythm. The excavation at Meadowbrook Field had been shut down permanently, the university having determined that the site contained no genuine Roman remains. The property would eventually be sold, though at much reduced value given the scandal associated with it. Dr. Haydock stopped by that afternoon for tea, as he often did. He settled into his usual chair and accepted a cup with evident pleasure. "You solved another one, Jane," he said with admiration. "How do you do it? How do you always manage to see what others miss?" Miss Marple smiled slightly, her needles clicking in their familiar rhythm. "I don't see anything that isn't there," she replied. "I simply pay attention to details that others might overlook. The mud under the fingernails that didn't match the trench soil, the expensive fabric caught on brambles, the missing notebook, the inconsistencies in timing and location." She paused in her knitting, looking thoughtful. "But more than that, I try to understand human nature. People's actions always make sense if you understand their motives and their character. Mr. Thornbury and Mr. Marsh were desperate men who made desperate choices. They convinced themselves that a small fraud would harm no one, that they could control the situation. But fraud has a way of spiralling out of control, and when Dr. Ashford threatened to expose them, they made an even more desperate choice. The tragedy is that it was all unnecessary," Dr. Haydock observed. "Both men could have found legal solutions to their financial problems." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, "but pride often prevents people from seeing the honest path. They're so focused on maintaining appearances, on avoiding embarrassment or reduced circumstances, that they choose dishonesty instead. And once you start down that path, each step leads inevitably to the next. A small deception becomes a larger fraud. The threat of exposure leads to violence. It's like a complex knitting pattern, you see. Once you make a mistake and try to cover it rather than correcting it, the entire piece becomes distorted." She held up her current work, an intricate pattern in soft blue wool. "This pattern is called Roman steps, rather appropriate given the circumstances. Each stitch must be placed precisely for the pattern to work. One careless stitch and the whole design is ruined, rather like life, really." Dr. Haydock smiled. "You have a gift for finding metaphors in everything, Jane." "Not metaphors," Miss Marple corrected gently. "Patterns. Life is full of patterns, repeating behaviours and predictable consequences. Once you learn to recognise the patterns, the solutions to mysteries become quite obvious." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, sipping tea and watching the afternoon light slant through the windows. Outside, the village continued its peaceful existence. Children played in the street. The postman made his rounds. Mrs. Price Ridley walked past with her shopping basket, no doubt heading home to telephone friends with the latest news. "There is one thing I wonder about," Dr. Haydock said after a time. "Patricia Marsh. Do you think she'll recover from this experience? She's lost her father to prison, her academic mentor to murder, and very nearly destroyed her own future." Miss Marple considered the question carefully. She's young, and the young are remarkably resilient. She made a terrible mistake in helping to conceal the crime, but she did so out of loyalty to her father, which speaks to her capacity for love and devotion. Those qualities, properly directed, will serve her well in the future. She's learned a hard lesson about the cost of dishonesty and the importance of truth. That knowledge, painful as it was to acquire, will make her a better archaeologist and a better person. "I hope you're right," Dr. Haydock said. "I usually am," Miss Marple replied with a slight smile. "Not because I'm particularly clever, but because I've lived long enough to see how these stories tend to end. The young who learn from their mistakes generally do quite well. It's those who refuse to learn, who blame others and continue making the same errors, who are truly lost. As the afternoon faded into evening, Miss Marple reflected on the case one final time. Dr. Marcus Ashford had died because he insisted on truth and integrity in his field. He had refused to be complicit in fraud, even when confronted with threats and pleas. His death was a tragedy, but his legacy would live on in students like Thomas Webb, who had learned from his example. The murderers had been caught and would face justice. The fraud had been exposed, and the archaeological community would be more vigilant as a result. And a young woman who had made a terrible mistake had been given a second chance to build an honest life. In Miss Marple's experience, that was about as close to a satisfactory resolution as one could hope for in the messy, complicated business of human affairs. Justice wasn't always perfect, but it was better than the alternative. Truth might be painful, but it was preferable to comfortable lies. And while evil existed in the world, there were also good people who fought against it, who insisted on integrity even at great personal cost. She picked up her knitting again, her needles moving with practiced ease, creating order from tangled threads. The pattern was complete, the mystery solved, and St. Mary Mead was peaceful once more. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new observations, new puzzles to solve, but tonight there was only the quiet satisfaction of truth revealed and justice served. Miss Marple continued her knitting as darkness gathered outside her windows. The pattern emerged stitch by stitch, each piece fitting precisely into its place, just as the pieces of Dr. Ashford's murder had finally arranged themselves into a complete and comprehensible whole. It was, she reflected, rather beautiful how patterns worked, in knitting as in life. You simply had to pay attention, understand the underlying structure, and have patience to see the design through to its end. The case of the drowned archaeologist was closed. Dr. Marcus Ashford could rest in peace, his integrity vindicated, his murder avenged, and Miss Jane Marple could return to her quiet life in St. Mary Mead, observing human and nature in all its complexity, ready for whatever mystery might next disturb the peace of her beloved village. The end.